Thanks to all of you for having me here, and a special thanks to the principal, Father Charles, to the HOD, and to the faculty here. I met David, I met Vijay ma'am. So it's been a long time since I actually spoke at maybe 6 months. Spoke at an English department in a university. So I want to thank every one of you for coming here and for hosting me. I'm going to go straight into the topic that I want to talk about. So this was about revisiting classics and reinterpreting classics. So basically, what is it that writers of today, and why is it that we want to do something with classics? Because as it is, time is very limited, and there's always the question of, do you write your own stuff, or do you engage with history in other forms? And so today the broader outline would be why classics fascinate me, and why I think it's a political responsibility to engage with them, and also what is it that I do in my own literary engagement with classics. So for me, the idea is that what exactly is a classic? What makes a text a classic? I believe that there's hundreds of ways of talking about it, but for me, I think one of the ways is, what is a classic? I think the classic is a text that lives in our midst. So you talk about the Tirukural, for instance, right? And it's something that children are learning in school. It's something that there's always one or two couplets from the Tirukural that is written in the buses. It's something that people quote on stages. And in some way, and this is not just like, a text like that, but let's say even the epics, right? Let's take the Ramayana, let's take the Mahabharata. But these are stories that live in us in some form, shape, dimension, perspective, which we cannot escape, because they are there, and they are transmitted culturally. They are transmitted through every single way. So the question then is, when the text is alive in our midst, do we consider that text a living thing, or do we consider the text something dead? Because if you look at this text as something that is fossilized in amber, something that cannot be changed, something that is unchanging, and something that is permanent and not alterable, that means that we are basically, in other words, considering the text as a dead thing, as a dead object, because it's only something that that ends up in that what you call that extremity of being dead, that is not changed. If the text, on the other hand, is a living being, then it is going to do what all living beings do. The text is going to change according to circumstances. The text is going to take new meanings according to circumstances. The text is going to do what people do, which is that under pressure, it's going to reinvent itself. The text is going to do things which, again, people do, which is, based on their material circumstances, based on their cultural circumstances, based on whether they're pushed into a corner or whether they're conquered. So, and this is what I think that we have to understand in terms of text, the fact that, they breathe, that, they have a life, and therefore that to breathe this life into them, to look at them with new meanings, to give them new meanings, to give them new interpretations, is also part of what writers do. And for me, there's another thing that keeps changing. Just as we look at texts as people, or the fact that texts are embodied creatures, I think we also have to look at the fact that every text is situated in two things. One is language, and the other is culture. And language is something that's constantly evolving, right? I mean, Gen Z slang is something that millennials don't get. So when language itself is so constantly evolving, the text cannot also be, in that state of non-evolution. It cannot be in that stasis. The text also has to evolve. And the same thing happens to culture. None of us are in the same culture that we are. Sometimes we are progressing, and oftentimes I think we are also regressing. When it comes to women and women's rights, things we find that culture has this very strange mechanisms going on, and I think these are actually reflected in the text. I'll talk about this in just a bit. So, and I think that once you recognize many of these things, like language is a living creature with a heartbeat, culture is, you know, a living thing with a heartbeat, and a text that's rooted in this is also a living thing, then you can understand why it can, you know, transform itself, why it can metamorphose into something else, why it can take on different meanings, different shades, different characteristics, and different interpretations. And again, the second question for me is, once we establish this, then we move on to this, why do we have to revisit classics? And I think there's a very practical answer to that. The practical answer to that is, if I want to write a feminist story, I can say, okay, so I called out somebody on rape culture today, or I can invent a character, call her, I don't know, Shreya or something, and say that Shreya was, you know, confronted by an instance of, you know, rape culture. She called it out, and I can create a storyline. But it's all. But this story, in order to reach people, and it's not the easiest thing. It's not an easy pipeline to form a story, to get it to an audience. Whereas I think what the classics allow us, especially myths allow us, what the epics allow us, is that they have these ready-made templates that everybody knows. So you do not do the hard work of having to establish the basic facts. You don't have to say, okay, there is a story called the Ramayana and there are these characters. I mean, you don't have to invent it. The story, the form, the frame actually exists. And so when you revisit it, you allow yourself the opportunity to retell the story instead of telling the story again. And then there's something else that, you know, again, why do we go back to classics instead of telling our own stories? Because it's very essential to tell our own stories. It's very essential to tell stories from the margins which have never been told. It's very essential to talk about women's experience, which for some reason has never been considered part of high literature, part of high culture, culture with a capital C, literature with a capital L. So I think we owe ourselves that massive, massive responsibility. But we should also, you know, because there's something else that is happening around classics. And one of those things is the fact that if you don't change a story, if you don't change the telling, then the story becomes a trap. The story becomes so fixed, the story becomes so permanent that it tells you that there's only one ending. It tells you that, you know, if a woman has desire, then it's going to end in tragedy. This is what they do. So there is this kind of predetermination about stories that I think can only be challenged or can only be in some ways subverted by going back to these classics. And this is why I think that, you know, whether we call them stories, whether we call them fictions, myths, legends, they all allow you the space to, what are we actually doing when we say we are revisiting classics? Because what we are doing is not a PhD, right? Like, I'm not saying, oh, I want to revisit classics because, okay, that'll get me a PhD degree. So you're not revisiting classics because, okay, I have to do a term paper, therefore I think what at the heart of it is the exercise of imagination. So the fact that you think differently, the fact that you can dream a different ending, you can dream a different plot point, you can dream the character reacting differently, or you can dream a different reinterpretation. So I think that so much of this idea of revisitation of classics is basically rooted in this act of imagination as rebellion, imagination as a form of assertion, but also imagination as, you know, laying claim to space, to history. So when somebody does, like, let's say, a feminist retelling, I think Volga did that with the Ramayana, saying it from Sita's perspective. And when people are doing this feminist retelling, they are trying to capture the narrative and to say, look at what the same story looks like when it's told from the eyes of a woman. Look at what the story looks like when it's told from the eyes of, you know, the oppressed people. Look at what the story looks like when it's told from the perspective of the victims. And I think this is like, this active act of imagination allows you something to tell the story with a different ending, because then you allow yourself to imagine a different fate, a different future, a different outcome. And so much of this is again this question of, you know, and then we can ask the very obvious question, because what would the author say? In terms of classics, and very often the authors are dead, so, you know, the question is, you take this absolute liberty, but also this idea, this authority to change a story is not like a permission. It's not like, okay, I apply to the principal, sir, and say, sir, can I rechange this story? Nobody needs to give you permission. Nobody needs to tell you. I mean, because the myths and because the epics and because they're so much part of our culture that everyone has the equal right of access. I can tell a different story because these stories belong to me. There is no one, version of, Ram or Sita or Yudhishthira that belongs to one particular set of people. They belong literally, if they belong to the national imagination or, the cultural imagination, that means each of us has the same rights to do with it what we think we can do with it. And I think that my first retelling, and I don't want to make this about me, but in some ways talking about my work is the way I'll tell you how I am engaging with it. So one of my first poems was called Ekalaivan. So in the Mahabharata, this is an Adivasi person or a tribal who wants to learn archery, and Drona says, I cannot teach it to you. So he teaches Arjuna, who is his his student, the one he wants to shine. And therefore, like Ekalaivan, in Tamil it's Ekalaivan, I think in Hindi it's Ekalavya or something. So Ekalaivan basically practices with this image of Drona, and he excels so much with it. And when he goes and wants to pay his respects, or what you call quote unquote Guru Dakshina, then Drona demands from him that you have to sacrifice your right thumb. And for me, I think the HOD sir was reading a little bit of my own biodata, which made me extremely embarrassed. It's another story. But one of the things that I realized was, at that age, when I was writing poems, 17 or 18, I was seeing very close what was happening within academic institutions, like the IIT Madras, like these places that are, absolutely, they somehow associate Brahmanic hegemony with academic excellence. And what actually happens to young people? Today I read this headline. I mean, it is a clickbait headline, but it said, the rate of suicide among Indian students is higher than the rate of the population growth. I mean, this may be not comparing the most likely things, but the fact is it's still a shocking number. And this shows that something is going wrong in our educational institutions. That sometimes if students are forced to part with their life, it means that it is a kind of academic terrorism that is happening. It is something that is, because young people are the people who want to live life the most. They are the people who have dreams. They are the people who have, whom the future owes something. And so when I was seeing what was happening around me, I really felt that we are living in many ways through the reiteration of the same thing, that people of certain dominant and oppressive castes are demanding the Ekalaivans of today to sacrifice their most powerful, their most ambitious, their most rebellious personalities. That what education actually does is in some ways to castrate you intellectually, to make you somebody who is not efficient, to take from you what is it that you have worked so hard to get by yourself. Because often people say, okay, you make money, people can take your money from you, you're beautiful, age is going to take it away from you. The only thing that people cannot take away from you is education, but that itself is not true, because we have seen that under what happens is that gets taken away as well. So, and this was a poem of, how do you tell young people, how do you tell people of your generation that, you're going to face this. There is no escape from this. And when you're going to face this, how do you come to terms with it? And there was an interesting statistics actually. I didn't know the statistic when I wrote the poem, but it'll actually help us understand what was happening or what is happening in India even better. I was reading a history of the Justice Party. And in this history of the Justice Party, they have a little tabulation of the rate of male literacy according to every caste. So in 1901, it's in every 10 years once there was a census. So this was taken as part of the census. So it's taken in 1901, 1911, and 1921. So, and it's, it was obviously during the British period, people who loved numbers. Today we are talking about the caste census and why we need a caste census. So Tamil Brahmins, for instance, in 1901, male literacy. And that's the thing, nobody talks about female literacy because the idea of giving education to women was such a huge taboo, right? Like completely kept outside of it. So Tamil male Brahmin literacy in English was 17%, which went up to 22%, and in the next 20 years it went up to 28.21%. And then you have other castes. You have like Kamma Naidus, who are like dominant, landowning, not necessarily people known for egalitarian things themselves, living in the feudal dream. And their numbers go from 0.03 in 1901 to 0.5 in 1921. So, and imagine like today what we're talking about, reservation, representation, the caste census, this was just 100 years ago. So, and they were not even enumerating, like nomadic tribes or things, like they were enumerating Velalas. Again, much less, single digit numbers. And then you realize that this is the system, this was the underlying system into which we all went to learn education. This is the system into which, the disruption, there was a disruption that was happening because of, institutions like this, or the work of Jesuits and, the work of Dalit movements like Ayyankali and others. But at the same time, this highly unequal system into which you throw young people, you throw Dalit people, you throw Adivasi people, you throw Bahujan people, and you tell them to get an education. But is anybody willing to give you that education? And if you do get educated, what happens to you? So I think that nobody talks about it because we all believe that our silences help us, just as we don't talk about rape culture, because being quiet about it some way allows us to escape. So this poem was written very much about what happens to Dalit, Bahujan, young people, and how do you retaliate to it. And I'm not going to give much more introduction, but just read the poem. So it says, this note comes as a consolation. You can do a lot of things with your left hand. Besides, fascist Dronacharyas warrant left-handed treatment. Also, you don't need your right thumb to pull a trigger or hurl a bomb. And so for me, this was like how you reimagine this poem, that, I don't change the fundamentals of the story. Ekalavan still loses his thumb. But what he does is, he still is finding ways how to be militant in the system. How do you fight this system? How do you call out fascism? And how do you work when you have been made disabled on purpose? When you have your, things taken away from you? How do you reinvent yourself for the larger struggle? And this is what I felt, was, okay, here you're addressing the question, but reimagining a different ending. Reimagining him not as somebody who lost, but as somebody who, what the corporate neoliberal world calls, he got a different skill set. So, and I think that this is again, and once I was doing a couple of these poems, I realized at some point, and this is very interesting because I think English literature gives you the space more than anything else, is to look at the idea of a project. I wanted to do this project of writing or rewriting a lot of Tamil and Hindu mythology from a very feminist perspective. And I was not writing into blankness. Maybe it was not a huge project in Indian English writing, but I had examples. I think there was Carol Ann Tuffy who wrote this book called The World's Wife. So she was imagining every story told from the perspective of the wife of a famous man. So if it was Atlas, what was the story of Mrs. Atlas? So if it was Hercules, what was the story from his wife's perspective? So every single character, it was like, imagine like this. So I thought that's such an interesting way, right? Because these women have not been written into history. So there's absolute space to take the story and to, put this. And then there was, I think, Anne Sexton who wrote Transformations. And so what Transformations did as a book was, I think it took all the fairy tales, especially the Grimm brothers fairy tales, and it gave them wrote a different Snow White, wrote a different Cinderella, and I felt that, that was a book again that spoke to me. And the third was also Margaret Atwood. She had not necessarily a collection, but she had poems here and there that I think was again dealing with, Greek mythology and trying to retell these stories. And then I think engaging with these works gave me the confidence to say, okay, let us try and do something with, the myths that exist among us and try to rewrite them. And here I think that it's very interesting because Okay, in terms of, let's say, um, the Ramayana, for instance, the part of what the story tries to tell you or tries to teach you is Sita wants a female, she wants a deer. She basically desires for it. So she sends her husband and his brother on a chase. Therefore, they get into these encounters that lead to trouble, but also she doesn't listen to advice. She talks to strangers, and all of these are like the way the story is written. But you could say, and then all of this tragedy, the 14-year separation, this war with Ravana, whatever, you can say that all of this happens because of her, and blame the woman here. But you could also look at the same story, not change any fact of the story, but say Sita was the first woman to step across the line. And therefore, in just retaining the same story, but looking at her from a different perspective, you change the story. So Sita is not what the suffering person or the person who is the root of suffering, but she's also, in that sense, the radical feminist. She's a powerful woman who decides to exercise her autonomy, who decides to exercise her independence, who decides to be a feminist in the sense that she decides, no, I want to go and talk to somebody. I want to step across the line. So I don't necessarily have to do what you tell me to do. And I think this critical aspect of how do you find a bridge? How do you take a story that has been made, or that has, even if it has been made with other purposes, that has been used for the explicit purpose of putting women in their place, and then taking that story to tell another message. And this is what I think means to actually engage with a classic in that way. And this is not the first time that's happened, because with the Ramayana, it's a long history, but at least the things that we are very aware of is what Periyar did with the Ramayana. So he rewrote the Ramayana from, the idea that Ravana was the hero for him, and Rama was an anti-hero. He called it Kimayana. And I think Ambedkar also, was dealing with the text in the sense that he wrote riddles in Hinduism, which led to a lot of bans and all. But here for me is that when you're doing this feminist work, is that it's not to say, okay, we are banning the epics, we are burning the epics, but to take them and to give this liberatory edge to them, to say that, no, this is how I'm going to look at these people, because there's no way we are going to we cannot imagine a world where all the myths can be erased, because that's not how popular consciousness works, that's not how cultural memory works. So the way you can actually make an impact in cultural memory, in people's collective conscience, is to, be transgressive. And this, I think, is how, transgression comes as a part of literature. And then it's not necessary, for a lot of people, this would appear like, oh, why is she working with Hindu myths? Well, part of it is because I was born Hindu. But the second thing is also, I wanted to also work with this Tamil myth, or Tamil epic, called the Silapadigaram. So Silapadigaram is again very central to Tamil identity culture. But in the story, there is, it's a very interesting story of mistaken killing, in which Kannagi is, married to a man called Kovalan, and at some point they fall on bad, times, and they are in poverty. So she gives her anklet to sell, and the queen at the same time loses her own anklet. So the husband, Kovalan, is taken and punished, and he's punished with death. And later, Kannagi takes the other anklet to the court, to Ilangar's court, and she breaks her anklet, which is filled with rubies, and the queen's anklet was apparently filled only with coral. And the king sees that he's did an act of grave injustice. But what has happened to Kannagi's story is that in the way that it's told in Tamil Nadu especially, is that Kannagi was such a chaste wife. She was so devoted to her husband. And then the other thing is that Kovalan also actually leaves her at some point and goes behind a dancing woman, or what you call, has a concubine, which is Madhavi. And it's only when he's absolutely ruined with her, he comes back to his wife, the wife forgives him and takes him back. And people are like, which of the two women, Kannagi or Madhavi, which of them is more chaste to this man? And so Kannagi has been, made into this symbol of chastity, or unquestioning obedience, unquestioning loyalty. But what is, so the story is something that, Ilango Adigal wrote the story, and you necessarily do not go and change the story. But what for me was very interesting was, how do you look at Kannagi? It's very, especially in today's context, especially for people of our age. And for me, it was very important that okay, I didn't want to know what is happening with Kannagi and her husband, whether she bet him up, or whether she was upset with what he did, or whether she asked him a lot of bad questions, or whether she said, okay, you have a side chick, I'm going to have some other thing on the side. All that is their problem. But I think where she really stands out is the fact that she goes to the king and asks for justice. And the fact is that, she shames the system. She seeks justice from a system where there has been a miscarriage of justice. She goes and confronts the seat of power. And she doesn't do this because she is powerful. She goes and does this because she's just this one woman who wants justice. And I thought that's what militancy is about. That's what the need to not worry about what power structures do, but to seek claim for justice, to go and wage this fight. Doesn't matter, like she goes into this king, she could have been killed, anything could have happened to her, but she's so fearless because she knows that justice is on her side. For me, then, okay, we have to escape this woman from the trap of being a wife. Because she should not be seen as a wife, she should be seen as this powerful figure who went and asked for justice. And not only asked for justice, but apparently the legend is that she burnt the city of Madurai by pulling out her left breast and cursing the town of Madurai. So it's a very interesting story. So for me, there was this idea of how do we bring Kannagi alive, and how do I tell her story. So, ma'am, do you have the time to read that poem? Okay. So I'll just read this poem. I won't torture you with too many poems, but this one I would read. One second. Okay. Now the problem is I don't know where I saved it on my system. So yeah. Okay. Miss Militancy. She thought she was dying. Ants crawled under her flaking skin. Migraines visited her at meal times. Her tenderest tomato breast bruised to touch. Her heart forgot its steady beat. Floundering at 40, she twisted safety pins into spirals, chewed on pencil ends, tore down calendars, became a hurricane around the house. That wetness with its lunar reek never came. Her monthly drip had disappeared. Her no-money man was back home by then, ditched and duped by his dancer mistress. She forgave that bitch, buried the bad blood between, gave him her anklet of rubies to sell and begin some business with. He went. A week later, she received his body bag with the executioner's seal on the toe tag. She stormed into the palace, flung her other anklet at the bloody throne. The royals too saw the red. The king died of shame, the queen died of shock. On the edge, Miss Militancy bayed for more blood. Vending vengeance, she made a bomb of her left breast and blew up the blasted city. Long after that land had turned into ashes, the rest of her plucked breast bled. Watching that breast sprout back from its roots, the lone woman learned to outgrow her loss. When the scars no longer showed and the faraway sea could be smelt between her legs, she dissolved in a mist of after smoke. This was my re-rendering of the poem. So now I have handled two of the topics that I said I would, deal with about the. About this idea of revisiting classics. One is the anti-caste perspective, the other is the feminist perspective. Now I want to come to the third topic, which is the decolonial perspective, and what does it mean to look at a text from a decolonial perspective. So for me, there are two issues with the word decolonial. Is that when we talk about decolonial, the offhand understanding is that we are talking about a certain British influence, a certain Dutch influence, or, that pervades all our fiction. So what happens during the Victorian era? What happens because we were governed by the British? But I think that we have to push decolonialism as a concept even far back. So what is it like? How does a language like Tamil look at the fact that there was Sanskritic hegemony? How do we look at the fact that there was Brahminical incursions into the text? How do we look at the patriarchal incursions into the text? And we have to push back against that, because this is also decolonizing. Like, we cannot say, okay, only white people are colonizers. Because I think that is very racist in itself, right? Like we only recognize one form of violence because that person has a certain type of skin, because this violence has happened with other people. So I think for me, the idea of this whole paradigm of decolonization has to not only address what, British colonization did, but also address what happens with, this kind of Sanskritic colonization that happened. Because in Tamil, this is not something that, okay, you come up in 2020 and you talk about it, because in Tamil it's been a huge issue. Around in 1900s, there was somebody realized that more than 50 to 60% of Tamil words were Sanskrit words, because the hegemony was so strong and the power was so. And then there was a movement within Tamil to revive Tamil, to say, let's go back to using pure word roots, because how will our language survive if our language is, having to, kind of bow its head, or having to, give way to such hegemony. So then people were like, okay, going back to the older word roots and kind of cleansing Tamil of the incursion of Sanskrit into it. And it was not a new phenomena. So I think it's quite interesting that, because, and for me, it's not just at the level of language, but it's also something at the level of thought. So I'm going to come to it in a second. So the book that I chose to engage with is this book called the Tirukural, written by Valluvar. And so I did not do all of the book as a translation, but I did the last section of the book, which is like 250 couplets or kurals that deal with love. And what was very interesting was, this was the first time a woman was translating a text. And I started on this, started with this basic question that, how is it possible that, the Kurals actually start with something that says, Anangukull Aimayil Kullu Kanangulai Madurkul Malum Inenji, or it says Pandariyen Kutrin Badana Ini Arinden Pentagayal Per Markatu, which is like, this guy sees this woman and he's like, my heart is now, like rocking, and nothing can steady this, because this lady is wearing long earrings, and is she a demoness, or is she something so powerful, goddess? And then another thing he says, I never knew that thing which is called death. And now I know, because it's striking me with this woman's eyes. So this woman is so powerful, so at the heart of it. But this woman who exists in the text doesn't exist as a commentator for the text. She doesn't exist as an intellectual who talks about the sexual politics of the text. She doesn't exist as a translator of the text. She doesn't exist as a scholar of the text. So I'm like, but this is a Tamil woman. It's a woman in the book. But where is this woman in any paratextual incarnation? Like, the woman is there in the book, and she's a powerful woman, she's intimidating men. But do you allow this woman to exist in any other structure, shape, or form? And then I'm like, well, we cannot ask this question, because we have to go and be that woman. You have to go and be that woman who says, well, this is a text. I'm going to tell you what I think this text means. I'm going to tell you how this text interacts, how this text works. And then when you look at the history of the Tirukkural, it's very interesting, because you read this, these are like 250 Kurals. Everyone has like, you can call it a morpheme, but roughly we can also say 7 words each. So at some point, what are we looking at, like 250 into 8, like 2,000 words. It's not huge. In terms of an actual corpus, it's not a huge number of words. And then you realize that, let's start with the less problematic of the colonization that has happened, the British. So you look at these translations. The earliest translation was actually by a Jesuit priest, who actually called himself Veerama Munivar, took on a Tamil name, and he translated. I think his Italian name was Constantine Besci, and he did this into Latin. And at the time he did this translation, it was seen as outrageous for a priest to translate the love poetry. So he does not translate it. The first translation of the Tirukkural only deals with the first 2 parts of the Tirukkural, which is about virtue, or what we call materialism, and the second part, what we call morality, and the second part of it, which is called porul, or what we call materialism. The third part on inbam, pleasure, or love, or desire, it's not done by him. And later, G.U. Pope decides to, at some point, maybe 70, 80 years later, decides to translate it, and he himself is like, previously, the other priests are not translating this because it's seen as outrageous. And then G.U. Pope is looking for a reason of how do I go and translate this text. And then he reads something else in the Kural that says, மனத்துக்கண் மாசிலனாதல் அனைத்ததற்கண் ஆகுல நீரப்பிற. And that actually means that everything depends on, the purity of your purpose, what's in your heart. I mean, if your heart is pure, that's all that matters. Everything else is sound and fury. And then he says, this is what Valluvar meant, and somebody so great like Valluvar could write about desire. That means that I can translate it without being called names, without being somebody, seen as into quote unquote lowly pursuits, quote unquote things like love, things like desire, things like sex. And this also comes into this very interesting space, because then they start translating. But even when they're translating, they're working in this very Victorian paradigm, in this very notions of prudery and shame. So what happens is that you come across a lot of words like union, and they're not talking about trade unions. So, and then they're talking about Congress. They're not talking about the Indian National Congress. So there's this way in which, and this is very interesting, because, okay, even if Tamil was like a language that's not spoken, that has, fallen into disuse, and that's not a living language, we'd be like, okay, maybe this is the meaning. But Tamil has the same word for love, kadal, that exists today, that existed then. The same word for desire, kamam, that exists today, that existed then. In 2000 years, the word has not changed. But there is so much shyness in translating love as love, sex as sex, desire as desire. But the text is full of those references. And then you realize that that's because that's what, that was the kind of moral paradigm, that was the kind of patriarchal outlook, that was the kind of Victorian prudery that was informing these texts. And some way you have to liberate these texts. Maybe they did it because they were men, maybe they did it because they were white men, maybe they did it because they were repressed English people. I just don't know. But, and then but the text is a living thing, and the text needs to, it needs to, what I think is, how do you liberate? Is that the bell for me, ma'am? Okay, I'm going to finish in 5 minutes. So how do you liberate this captive text? And this is when I started, like doing this translations of, and trying to, actually be true to the text itself. And to try to write exactly what was in the text without having these notions in your head, right? Like, okay, I can't use this word, I can't use that word. And to make it, because the text is like there are 250 couplets of 250 chorals, and there's so much about female desire, there's so much about women talking about what they want and what they feel and what they love. And you cannot erase that. And the second thing that actually happened to this book, which again I think needed, a lot of debate, which is that around the 12th century, there was a commentary by someone called Parimil Alagar, who's a very important commentator of the Kural, but who also was like a very Brahmin Sanatani, who's constantly, So what he does is this idea of, so in many places in the Kural, for instance, it says, Pennin peruntakka yavula karpennum tinmai undaga perin. That is, what is greater in the world than women? As long as they have this powerful thing called karpu. And this is where it's very interesting, because he starts defining this karpu as chastity. He starts defining this karpu as devotion to the husband. But the original Tamil word, called Tinmai, it's about how strong a woman is. Like, what is greater in the world than a woman? Nothing except, once she's strong, there's nothing greater than her. And so the word that, because that's what Tinmai means, you go and look at what Tinmai means. It's about resolve, it's about, determination, it's about confidence, it's about self-determination. But how easily men go into a text and, say, okay, but that's what it means that, you're devoted to the husband. And the meaning changes, and once it changes, everybody else, in the system of commentaries, that this guy is a big guy, great guy, everyone else writes that, and then everyone else translates from this commentary. So everyone talks about chastity. And then you're like, but that's not what he means, that's not what Tamil means. I mean, like, you go back to the word root. You go back, and that's not what was there. It was about being strong, being powerful, that being full of, so complete in yourself, that and that's what I think is very interesting in fact. And why do I do this? People would be like, why do you have to do to the Thirukural of all the books? Because I think in terms of Indian history, Indian culture, it's very important to have a powerful text that we think can reflect our lives. And one of the things that, the choral differentiates, let's say, with the Manusmritis. The Manusmriti says you cannot trust a woman to sit with her father or son or brother, because the nature of women is to tempt even the wise. So do not be alone with them. That's the kind of understanding. Because, and then they're like, women don't need anything. As long as it's a man, it's okay. This, and compared to this kind of understanding of, women as being temptresses and seductresses and people who are like not to be believed or trusted. On the other hand, you have a text that believes that women can be strong only if they are autonomous. That women can, take care of themselves only when they are totally free. And it's up to women to be so powerful and strong. And so I went and, I kind of worked on this, tried to escape the text from this kind of, what I call liberating a captive text. And I faced a lot of, very interesting feedback to this. Because some of you may know Tamil, so it says, Sirai Kakam Kapu Yevan Seyyum Magalir Nirai Kakam Kape Thala. It says, what is the point of, monitoring a woman as if it was a prison? Because it's only women who can, take care of themselves. And I think that's to give women that power. In order for them to feel safe or for them to feel themselves, I think that's such a critical point, and we have to, to go back to that feminist root of the text. But then what I realized now, and I'm going to finish with this, just give me the last 5 minutes, was I realized that I don't give interviews. I'm very shy because I say something and everything I say becomes controversial. So please, I hope nothing here becomes controversial. If not for me, for the sake of SJCC. So I said that, Valluvar wrote these love poems, and as a scholar of the text, as somebody who's looked at every single word in the text, in these 250 couplets, he doesn't say, dear wife, you're beautiful. He talks about dear women. She doesn't say, I miss my husband. She says, I miss my man, right? Critical, crucial difference. And I said that he might have written these poems for his side chick. And that was the end of it. Like, nobody bothered reading the book. Nobody bothered all the rest of the things I was saying. They were like, she is here to destroy Tamil culture. Of course, she's not even a Tamil woman. She's Telugu. That's why she's talking all this shit about Tamil people. And they were like, her mother is Telugu, her father is Telugu. They were doing all this DNA tests. I'm like, hey, even if you beat me, I can't get some Telugu words out of my system. Like, as Tamil as they come, so they were like, first you're not Tamil, then she's not a woman, then she's like all kinds of bad words, and this was going on in YouTube, and it was offensive. And then I would meet people like, in events, because people still kept calling me to these events. Older schedule, it was already programmed, no, they can't cancel me. And then they wrote emails also to America, FETNA and all, they wrote emails. How can you call her? How can you platform her? You have to cancel this. And so all the men are coming to me and saying, Madam, you're viral, no? And then like, so what do you say? No, I agree with you. But the thing is, they never say that in public. Because if they say that in public, people will be like... So when this happened, my first reaction was to call my mother and, for me, if my mother and father have my back, I can go and fight with anyone in the world. So I called my mother and said, Mama, what do you think about this? And she said, which man writes poems to his wife? Yeah. I got like, okay, I won this round. She has my back. She is not upset. And then I called my father. And he said, I watched your interview twice. Now this was worrying, right? And then he said, you're saying very bold things. And then I was like, okay, he supports me. I don't want more endorsement from him. Just the fact that you're saying things that nobody else would say, and it's very bold of you to say these things. And that's when I realized that, when you're a woman, it becomes so difficult. Because I go back and I read these conversations in the 1920s, and people are actually blaming Parimal Alagar. They're actually saying this man was putting a lot of patriarchal, notions into this book, a lot of Sanskritic notions into this book, and they had the freedom to call out because they were male scholars. But when you're a woman and you say even something very simple like this, like maybe, a lot of qualifiers, perhaps, the entire system descends on you. So I also think that's one of the reasons to, engage with classics, because, they are seen as things that you cannot touch. They are seen as things you cannot disrupt. You're not allowed to do that. You have to be a certain man of a certain background, of a certain class, of a certain caste, in order to even comment on them, engage with them, work with them. So when you're actually even doing this task, I think it becomes this act of transgression. So I just want to, end on this idea that, we have to deal with the stories around us, especially stories that have stayed the same way for a long time. Because this is not just about literature, it's so much about power, struggle for power, it's about disrupting. And at the end of it, I think it's, an act of liberation. But yeah, thank you for having me here.